The Iraqi commander stood over the wounded ranger with a satellite phone in one hand and a pistol in the other, and he was smiling. Not the tight smile of a man who has survived something difficult, the wide, unhurried smile of a man who has already won and knows it. 17 fighters. One American Overwatch team. The spotter dead. The shooter bleeding from both legs. In a drainage ditch outside Ramadi, with his radio destroyed, and the nearest QRF 40 minutes out. The commander raised the pistol, then. The shot came from the wrong direction entirely. Then another. Then a third. The commander dropped the satellite phone and ran, and nobody in his unit could tell him where the rounds were coming from because the woman behind the rifle was not in any briefing document, any personnel roster, or any tactical assessment his intelligence people had produced. She was not supposed to be on that rooftop. She was supposed to be in a basement 3 blocks away, running signals intercept on a frequency that had gone cold 40 minutes ago. She had decided, without authorization, without orders, and without any official designation as a shooter, that the signals could wait. Petra Dolan had a particular relationship with numbers that most people found either impressive or unsettling, depending on how close they were standing when she started talking about it. She was 27 years old, a signals intelligence analyst assigned to the 504th Military Intelligence Brigade out of Fort Hood, which meant her official job was to sit in small rooms with large headsets and listen to electronic traffic that the enemy didn't know anyone could hear. She was exceptionally good at it. Her clearance level was high enough that she wasn't supposed to discuss it at dinner parties, which suited her fine because she didn't go to dinner parties. She went to the range on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on most Saturday mornings when the duty roster allowed it. She drove to the post range and shot, and the shooting was not a hobby. It was the thing she did when she needed to feel that something in the world was honest. Numbers were honest. Signals were honest. A bullet's trajectory, once fired, was the most honest thing Petra Dolan knew. It went exactly where physics said it would go, accounting for variables that you either understood or didn't, and if you missed, the miss was data, not accusation. She had grown up in Flagstaff, Arizona, which was relevant in the way that all geography is relevant to the kind of person it makes. Her father was a civil engineer who had spent 30 years designing water systems for municipalities across the Southwest, and he had raised his daughter with the understanding that the world was made of systems, that systems had logic, and that the most important skill a person could develop was the ability to see the logic clearly and work with it rather than against it. He had also, when she was 13, taken her to the Coconino County Fair and watched her put 3 rounds through the center of a paper target at a carnival shooting booth while the teenager running the booth looked increasingly uncomfortable. "You've done this before," the teenager said. "No," Petra said honestly, "but I've done the math." Her father had bought her a .22 the following Christmas and enrolled her in a junior marksmanship program at the Flagstaff Rod and Gun Club, and the instructor there, a retired postal worker named Dennis, who had served 2 tours in Korea and had no patience for people who treated firearms as accessories, had told her father after the 3rd session that she had the rarest combination of traits he had seen in 40 years of teaching: natural spatial reasoning, genuine patience, and a complete absence of ego about her own errors. "She doesn't get defensive when she misses," Dennis had said. "She just wants to know why." That was the thing. She always wanted to know why. She joined the Army at 22 after finishing a mathematics degree at Northern Arizona University, and the Army, with the particular institutional genius it sometimes displayed, had taken one look at her test scores and her degree, and placed her directly into signals intelligence, which was the right call for the Army's purposes and a slightly frustrating one for Petra's, because what signals intelligence gave her was an extraordinary view of the architecture of conflict and almost no ability to affect it directly. She could see the pattern. She could map the network. She could identify the commander's location from the metadata of his communications with a precision that still surprised her. And then she handed that information to someone else, and someone else did something with it, and she went back to listening. She was very good at her job. She was, according to her last 2 performance evaluations, among the top 3 analysts in her unit, which was a distinction that came with a commendation letter and no change in what she did every day. She didn't complain about this. Complaining was imprecise. What she did instead was go to the range. It was at the range that she met Sergeant First Class Raymond Dyer. Dyer was 43 years old and looked like a man who had been assembled from materials that were designed to last. He was not large, 5'10", maybe 180, but he had the particular density of someone who had trained specific muscle groups for specific purposes over a very long time, and his movements at the range had the economy of someone for whom wasted motion was a philosophical failure. He had been an infantry scout for 12 years and a designated marksman for 8, and he had the kind of record that didn't get written down in places civilians could read. He noticed Petra Dolan on a Thursday morning in November because she was doing something he almost never saw. She was dry firing between live rounds, running a deliberate trigger reset drill at the bench while most of the shooters around her were focused entirely on putting rounds downrange. She was also shooting a bolt-action Remington 700 that she had brought from home, which was unusual for a signals analyst on a Tuesday-Thursday range appointment. He watched her for 20 minutes before he said anything. "Your natural point of aim drifts left after the third repetition," he said finally. She didn't look up. "I know. My left shoulder rotates inward when I fatigue. I'm working on it." He pulled up a stool at the adjacent bench. "How long has it done that?" "About 18 months. I overcorrected a right drift problem and pushed too far." He looked at the target she was shooting. 3-inch groups at 200 meters, most of them centered, a few pulled left. "What distance are you trying to get to?" She set the rifle down and looked at him directly for the first time. She had the careful, assessing quality of someone who evaluated information before deciding how much of it to return. "What's the operational standard for your unit's designated marksman?" He paused. That was not the answer he had expected. 600, then 600, she said. "Minimum." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up her rifle, checked the chamber, examined the stock fit, and set it back down. "Your cheek weld is inconsistent. The stock is half an inch too long for your neck profile. Every 5th shot you're compensating by pulling your head down instead of raising the stock." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." That was how it started. Not with an invitation or a mentor's speech or a carefully constructed story about someone who had done something heroic in a previous deployment. Dyer was not a man who used stories as recruitment tools. He used corrections. He found problems, stated them without apology, and showed the path from the problem to its solution. What he had learned in 30 years of doing this was that the people worth teaching were the ones who responded to a correction by immediately trying to implement it, rather than explaining why the problem wasn't their fault. Petra Dolan responded to corrections like a mathematician encountering an error in a proof, with focused, impersonal interest in finding the right answer. He met her at the range the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, he started bringing his own rifle, an M110 SAS, and shooting beside her, not to demonstrate, but because the quality of his presence at the range was itself a kind of instruction. She absorbed things he didn't explicitly teach. The way he breathed before a shot, the way he read the wind without appearing to look at it, the way he cleared his mind between repetitions, not by thinking of nothing, but by thinking of exactly one thing. "What do you think about?" she asked him one afternoon after a string of shots that had been notably cleaner than anything she had produced the week before. "The problem," he said, "not the shot. The problem the shot solves." She sat with that. "What's the difference?" He looked downrange. A shot is a mechanical event. You can practice mechanics until they're automatic, and then the mechanics take care of themselves. But the problem, the reason the shot needs to happen, the specific consequence of a miss, the human weight of the decision, that's what your mind should be holding. Not the trigger, not the crosshair. The reason. He had never said anything quite like that to anyone he had trained before. He wasn't entirely sure why he said it to her. Perhaps it was because she asked the right questions. Perhaps it was because he had come to understand, already thinking about it anyway. By the end of the 3rd month, her groups at 400 meters were tighter than anything her previous practice had produced. Dyer had stopped correcting her mechanics and started talking to her instead about decision architecture. The mental process of evaluating a situation before a shot was required, so that when the shot was required, the mental work was already done. "You've read this target already," he told her one afternoon, setting up a scenario with multiple positions and a time constraint. "By the time you're behind the rifle, you should know which threat is the priority, why it's the priority, and what happens to the situation if you're wrong. The rifle is the last tool you use. Everything else is intelligence work." She looked at him. "That's what I do for a living." "Then you're better prepared for this than most people who've been doing it for years," he said. "The question is whether you can do both simultaneously." She could. He discovered this not during range sessions, but during the scenario drills he began running 3 months into her training, setting up complex multi-threat problems in the unused corner of a firing range that the post commander had agreed to let them use on the second Tuesday of each month. She processed the scenarios the way she processed signals intelligence, systematically, without attachment to her initial assessment, willing to revise the entire picture when new information required it. She got some of them wrong. She got a scenario wrong on a Wednesday in February that troubled her more than the miss had. "That was a non-combatant," Dyer said. He stated it flatly, the way you state a number. "The posture," she said immediately before he could continue. "The hands. The direction of movement relative to the shooting position, and I had already committed to the trigger before I finished reading the indicators." A pause. "I was shooting at the clock." Dyer looked at her. That was a phrase he had used once, in a different context, and she had filed it and retrieved it precisely when it fit. "Yes," he said. "What do you do with that?" "I rebuild the process," she said. "Not the shot, the decision that preceded it." He nodded once. That nod meant he had nothing more to add. It was the most complete form of acknowledgement Dyer offered. The formal paperwork, the documentation of her supplemental training, the assessment of her capabilities, the careful wording of a hypothetical recommendation, he handled quietly and without telling her. She would find out about it later, when it mattered, and not before. He had learned, in 2 decades of preparing people for things they didn't know were coming, that knowledge of the destination distorted the journey. Train for competence. Let the competence find its own application. 7 months after their first conversation at the range bench, Petra Dolan was the best shooter. Sergeant First Class Raymond Dyer had trained in 11 years of informal mentorship. He told her this on a Thursday afternoon in October after she had held a moving target at 580 meters in a 14-mile-per-hour crosswind, with a thermal rising from the baked desert pack that would have pushed the round 12 inches off center if she hadn't already accounted for it. He told her not as praise. He told her as data. "You should know where you are," he said, "because in approximately 3 weeks you're going to need to be there." She looked at him. "Is that an order?" "It's a fact," he said. "Orders come from people with authority over your assignment. I have authority over your range time. Everything else is your decision." She understood him well enough by then to hear what he was not saying. She did not ask him to say it. The operation was called Ridgeline Actual, and it was not the operation that Petra was officially part of. She was officially part of a 4-person SIGINT cell attached to the 3rd Ranger Battalion for a targeting package in Anbar Province. 3 days of signals collection designed to map the communications network of an insurgent commander named in 5 different intelligence reports under 4 different aliases. The cell would work from a hardened position 2 blocks from the objective building, running collection while the Ranger assault element moved on the target at 0200. The assault element included 2 snipers. Their names were Staff Sergeant Kowalski and Corporal Ames. They were assigned to overwatch from a rooftop to the north of the objective, covering 2 approach routes and the primary exfil corridor. What no intelligence assessment had accounted for, what the aerial surveillance had missed, what the informant network had not surfaced, was a second trigger element staged 3 blocks to the east, 16 fighters in 2 vehicles who had been told by someone with access to American operational patterns that something was going to happen in that block on that night and to be ready. Kowalski died at 0134 from a burst of fire that came from a direction nobody was watching. Ames was hit twice 30 seconds later. He was alive. He would not remain so for long without intervention that was not currently available. Petra heard it on the command frequency because she had been monitoring 3 frequencies, signed the collection mission, the assault net, and the command net, which she had added without authorization, because 7 months of thinking about the problem the shot solves had made her constitutionally unable to work in a situation without full signal coverage. She heard Kowalski's call sign go silent. She heard Ames transmit twice, and the second transmission was a single word, and it was the word that made her reach for the rifle case she had brought on this deployment without explaining to anyone why a SIGINT analyst was carrying a personal rifle into Anbar province. She had not been asked. Nobody had asked because the rifle was her personal property, logged in her equipment manifest unremarkable. She had brought it because Dyer had told her to. He hadn't said that either. The rooftop she reached was 3 floors up via a staircase that required her to move through 2 rooms occupied by terrified Iraqi civilians who she addressed in the 12 words of Arabic she had memorized for exactly this category of moment. I am American. I am not here to harm you. Please stay down and stay quiet. The second room contained a man and 2 small children who stared at her with the specific wide-eyed stillness of people who have learned not to move when soldiers are present. She kept moving. The rooftop was open to the north and east. She found a position behind a concrete lip that gave her a clean line of sight down the drainage corridor where, according to the command net, Ames was down and a trigger element was consolidating. She ranged it. 240 meters to the nearest fighter, 310 to the commander, who was distinctive by the deliberateness of his movement, the way he was walking, not running, through the chaos of his own assault because he had no reason to run. He had already calculated the situation. She built her position the way Dyer had shown her. Not fast. Correctly. Fast was for later. She checked the wind. She noted the thermals coming off the street below. She calculated the angular compensation for the elevated position and the downward angle to the target. She did all of this in 90 seconds. Then she waited 4 more seconds because the commander had stopped moving and a stationary target was a more honest problem than a moving one. And she had learned patience in a way that most people who had been trained to shoot from birth had not, because she had come to it analytically through the mathematics of why it worked, and mathematical truths don't erode under pressure the way instincts sometimes do. The first shot broke at 0143. The commander did not die. She had not aimed to kill him. She had aimed to stop him, specifically and precisely, in a way that communicated to the 16 fighters around him that someone with accuracy was watching from an unknown position. The shot achieved this. The shot achieved exactly this. What happened in the next 22 minutes, Petra would account for later in the flat, sequential terms that her debrief required and that were also, she found, the only language adequate to the experience. Not because the experience was unfeeling, but because the feelings were too large and too permanent for any other container. She took 8 shots. 6 achieved their intended effect. 2 missed, both on moving targets at the outer edge of her reliable range, both corrected on the subsequent engagement. The trigger element did not withdraw. Insurgent elements rarely withdrew from an engagement that had been so carefully staged. But they stopped moving in the direction of the drainage corridor where Ames was down, and they started moving in a direction that indicated they were trying to locate the shooter, and a force that is trying to locate a shooter is not a force that is advancing on a wounded man. And that was the problem the shots were solving. At 0205, the QRF arrived. At 0211, Ames was extracted. At 0214, 2 Apache gunships turned the eastern approach into a different kind of problem entirely. When the command net called all clear, Petra Dolan was still in position. She had not moved from the concrete lip in 31 minutes. Her right shoulder ached from sustained firing position, and her left eye had the specific fatigue of extended optic use, and her mouth was very dry. She became aware in the silence that followed that her face was wet. She reached up and touched her cheek. She was not sure when that had happened. She had been so far inside the work, so completely dissolved into the problem and the process, that her body had apparently been managing itself without consultation. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She cleared the rifle and set the safety, and lay there for a long moment looking at the sky above Ramadi, which was beginning to go from black to the particular iron gray that preceded color and which had no opinion whatsoever about what had happened below it. A hand appeared at the edge of the stairwell access. A ranger sergeant named Hollis, who had been part of the QRF element, pulled himself onto the rooftop and looked at her and then at the rifle and then back at her. "You're the signals analyst," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "You've been up here the whole time." "Yes." Hollis looked out toward the eastern approach where the Apaches were still working. Then he looked back at her. He had the expression of a man updating a significant number of prior assumptions simultaneously. Ames is asking who was on the rifle. Petra was quiet for a moment. "Tell him the collection mission went quiet," she said. "I improvised." Hollis processed this. Then he said, "He's going to want to say thank you." "He can say it later," she said. "Right now I need to finish my intercept documentation before I lose the window." She went back downstairs. She sat in the signals collection room with her headset on and her collection equipment running and the rifle in its case beside her desk. And she wrote her intercept report first because the mission was the mission and the data was still there to be gathered. And then she wrote a second document that she addressed to Sergeant First Class Raymond Dyer at Fort Hood, which was not a formal report and was not an after-action submission. It was a letter, and it was 4 sentences long. "The situation changed. I made a decision. Ames is stable. You were right about the problem being different from the shot." She folded it and put it in her uniform pocket and completed the intercept documentation, and then sat in the quiet of the collection room with the day growing outside and held both things at once. The analyst who had listened and documented and tracked the invisible architecture of the enemy's communications, and the woman who had climbed 3 flights of stairs in the dark with a personal rifle, and made 8 decisions that the situation had not asked her to make officially, and that she was going to carry regardless. Dyer had told her that the carrying was where the work actually lived. She was beginning to understand the specific geography of that. The debrief was conducted by a colonel named Whitfield, who had the focused intake quality of someone for whom information was the primary currency of all human exchange. He wanted everything. The collection data first, then the tactical sequence, then each shot. Distance, conditions, decision criteria, outcome. She gave him everything in the same register she used for intelligence summaries. Precise, sequential, without amplification or minimization. When she finished, Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Specialist Dolan, your MOS is 35N. "Yes, sir. You are not a designated marksman. You are not a trained sniper. You have not attended any formal qualification program for the capability you demonstrated last night." "No, sir." He looked at his notes. "And yet your shot data is consistent with someone who has." He set the notes down. "Sergeant First Class Dyer submitted documentation of your supplemental training 3 weeks ago. I've reviewed it." He paused. "You weren't told about the documentation?" "No, sir." "But you're not surprised she thought about this honestly?" "No, sir." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. He was the kind of senior officer who had learned to read people not from their self-presentation, but from the specific quality of their stillness under pressure. And what he was reading from Petra Dolan was something he encountered rarely enough that he made a note of it in the margin of his pad without quite meaning to. "You're going to be recommended for a commendation," he said. "That's not what you need to hear right now." "No, sir." "What Ames needs you to hear is that his team is alive because of where you chose to be. What I need you to hear is that what you did last night was not improvisation. Improvisation is what untrained people do under pressure. What you did was apply specific developed capability to a situation that required it." He paused. "The Army is going to pay attention to that, so will I." He dismissed her. She walked out of the debrief building and stood in the early morning light outside Ramadi and did not cry, because she had already done that on the rooftop without deciding to. And that had been sufficient. What she did instead was stand very still for several minutes and let the sun reach her. Ames was in the field medical station, his left arm in a temporary splint, his color better than anyone had a right to expect, given the 2 rounds that had hit him the night before. He was, when she arrived, in the middle of an argument with the medic about whether his injury classification warranted the level of administrative attention it was receiving. Through and through, he was saying, both of them. If I wanted this much paperwork, I'd have gone to JAG. The medic, who had clearly had this conversation several times, maintained the serene unresponsiveness of someone who had decided not to engage. Ames saw Petra in the doorway and stopped arguing. He looked at her with an expression that she could not categorize precisely, except to say that it was direct in a way that people generally only achieved after something large had happened to them. You climbed 3 flights of stairs in a combat zone to shoot from a rooftop with your personal rifle, he said, without orders. The signals window had closed, she said. He looked at her steadily. Hollis told me what you said. That was the least convincing cover story I've heard since I've been in the Army. She said nothing. I'm going to say something, Ames said, and I need you to hear it as data, because I don't do sentiment, and you probably don't either. He waited until she met his eyes. I was in that ditch counting the seconds until the commander made a decision about what to do with me. I know what the math looked like, and then the math changed. He paused. You changed it. Not the system, not the QRF. You, with a rifle you brought to Anbar province on your own judgment and your own assessment of what the situation might require. He let that settle. I've been in this work for 11 years, he said. I've had my life depend on someone else's capability exactly 4 times. Last night was one of them. You need to know that. Petra looked at her hands. How's your arm? The arm is fine. Webb is. He glanced at the medic. The medic is being thorough. The radius is cracked, the medic said pleasantly, still not looking up. Stress fracture, Ames said. Cracked radius, the medic said. She almost smiled. She stayed for 15 minutes. Then she went to find Dyer. He was not in Ramadi. He was at Fort Hood, which was where she had known he would be, which was why the letter she had written at 3 in the morning was a letter and not a radio call. She sent it through the unit mail system and then returned to her signals collection equipment and spent the remainder of the day doing her actual job, which needed doing, and which she did with the same precision she always brought to it, because the work was the work, and the data didn't stop being important because the night had been what it had been. Dyer's response arrived 8 days later. It was 6 words. Come find me when you're back. The recommendation Whitfield had mentioned reached Special Operations Command in 11 days. The approval, the formal documentation of an offer that had not yet been verbally extended, came back in 22. Petra was in the signals room running a collection analysis when Captain Hargrove walked in without knocking, which was unusual enough that she pulled her headset off immediately. He set a single sheet of paper on her desk beside her collection log. She read it. It was a formal invitation to apply to the United States Army Sniper School, Class 04 Echo, with a conditional pre-approval based on the operational record, Dyer's documentation, and a personal endorsement from a Ranger Lieutenant Colonel, whose name she recognized from 3 separate intelligence reports she had written over the past year. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Hargrove, who was watching her with the expression of a man who had not been sure how this moment would land and was now calibrating. Dyer? She said. Dyer submitted documentation, Hargrove said. Whitfield submitted the recommendation. The Ranger commander added the endorsement. He paused. The endorsement was Ames's idea. She looked back at the paper, at the official header, the dates, the unit designations, the formal language that turned a decision she had been building toward for 7 months without naming it into a set of orders with institutional weight behind them. I need to call my father, she said. Hargrove almost smiled. That seems right, he said. He left. She sat for a long moment in the signals room with the collection equipment running and the hum of the frequency monitors and the paper in her hands. And she thought about a carnival shooting booth in Flagstaff when she was 13 and the teenager who had looked at her like she had done something that shouldn't be possible, and her own answer, which had been the most honest thing she knew how to say. I've done the math. She called her father that evening. The connection was clear, which was unusual enough to feel like a small gift. He listened to everything. He asked 2 questions, whether she had understood what she was walking into, and whether she had made the decision herself. She said yes to both. There was a pause, not uncertainty, but the particular silence of a man receiving something important and giving it the weight it deserved. Then he said, "The math was always going to lead somewhere, Petra." She felt something move through her at that, quick and warm and then settling. "Yeah," she said, "I think so." He said okay the way her mother had always said it. The Flagstaff answer to large things, present, unperforming, ready to let the next thing be the next thing. "Then go," he said, "and call me when you get there." The 40 days before she reported to Fort Benning passed with a speed that surprised her. She filled them with range sessions that Dyer had specified in a training document he had written before she even knew the school was possible, because Dyer was a man who planned forward and who had apparently been planning this particular forward for longer than she had known the destination existed. She ran. She studied. She returned to the letter he had sent and read it again. Train for the problem, not the shot. The shot will find itself if the problem is clear. She carried his notebook, not his literal notebook, but the one she had started keeping after their third month together, the record of corrections and scenarios and late-range conversations that had accumulated into something she thought of as the architecture of her own capability. She had it in her bag when she arrived at Fort Benning on a Tuesday morning in March, one of 4 women in a class of 26, the only 35N, the only signals analyst who had ever arrived at this school with a conditional pre-approval and an endorsement from a ranger unit. People noticed. The noticing varied. She had expected this because Dyer had prepared her for it explicitly. "They're going to ask why you're here." The answer is never verbal. The answer is what you do in week 2. Week 2 was stalking. It was, by consensus, the thing that ended careers at sniper school. The physical demand was manageable. The mental demand, the absolute stillness over hours, the total suppression of the body's legitimate complaints, the discipline of moving forward by inches for so long that the ground itself seemed to resist you. That was the thing that found the limit in people. Petra Dolan did not have a limit in this area. She had discovered this not from anything in her training history, but from 11 years of sitting in small rooms with large headsets listening to signals that required sustained, unbroken attention for hours. Her mind locked on the frequency, her body forgotten. Stillness was not a practice she had developed. It was a default state she occasionally interrupted to do other things. Her primary instructor, a warrant officer named Castellano, who had worked with special operations units in 3 theaters and who communicated in a language of precision that she found deeply comfortable, watched her stalking assessment on the 3rd day of week 2 and said nothing during the exercise. At the debrief, he said, "Dolan, where did you learn to hold that long?" "Signals collection," she said. "Anbar province." He looked at her. "That's not an answer I've gotten before." "It's the accurate one," she said. Castellano made a note. He moved on. But she understood from the specific completeness of the transition, the lack of any hedging or deferral, that she had passed a threshold he had been monitoring, and that the monitoring was finished. She wrote to Dyer that night. Castellano asked where I learned to hold. I told him signals collection. He seemed to find it explanatory. Week 3 is the test. He wrote back in 5 days. Week 3 is always the test. Don't shoot at the clock. She carried that letter folded in her left breast pocket for the entirety of week 3, which she needed because week 3 nearly broke her, not in the way she had expected. The shooting was where she was most confident, and it showed. Her field scores placed her 2nd in the class by the 3rd day, a position she held. What nearly broke her was a stress scenario on day 5, a multi-target problem in reduced visibility, with a deliberate complication introduced at 90 seconds that invalidated her initial shot solution and required a complete rebuild with 43 seconds remaining. She rushed the rebuild. The shot missed. She knew it in the trigger break, the specific absence of rightness that a shot without full preparation announced in the half-second before the round left the barrel. Castellano said, "Reset." She rebuilt. She did not rush. She took the time the problem required, not the time the clock allocated, because the clock was not the problem. The clock was a variable in the problem, and misidentifying variables was the most fundamental error in any analytical system. The shot landed clean. What was the difference? Castellano said. The first time I was solving for the constraint, she said. The second time I was solving for the target. He looked at her for a long moment. Write that down, he said. Exactly those words. She wrote it in her notebook, below Dyer's corrections, and above the wind call tables she had developed from 6 months of range data. Then she closed the notebook and went back to work. She graduated on a Friday. The ceremony was brief and efficient, and was attended by 21 of the 43 people who had started the course. She received her tab from the school commander, who said her name and her class ranking. First, without additional comment, because the school did not do additional comment. It was not that kind of place. Dyer was standing at the edge of the assembly area. She had not known he was coming. He had not said so in any letter. He had, she learned later, submitted leave paperwork 3 weeks before the graduation date, which meant he had filed it before she had her week 3 crisis, which meant he had known she would make it through week 3 before she had. That was the most Raymond Dyer thing she could imagine. She crossed to him after the ceremony without thinking about it. He extended his hand, which was what she expected, and she shook it, which was what he expected, and then she said, Castellano said I was the most patient student he'd seen in 3 years. I know, Dyer said. He called me. She looked at him. When? Week 2, stalking assessment, day 3. She absorbed this. What did you tell him, the truth? He looked at the tab on her sleeve. That the patience was already there. I just gave it somewhere to go. She felt the tightness in her throat that she had managed on the rooftop in Ramadi, and managed in the debrief, and managed in the medical station, with Ames arguing about his cracked radius. She did not manage it this time, because Fort Benning was not a position she needed to hold, and Dyer was not an audience she needed to perform for. He had seen exactly what was there from the first Thursday morning at the range bench, and he had never once asked it to be different. You told me the problem was different from the shot, she said. Yes, I didn't understand that until I was on the roof. No one does, he said. That's why it has to be learned the way you learned it, not as an instruction, as a consequence. He paused. Ames sent his regards. She almost laughed. Is the radius still cracked? He says no. The medic says yes. The situation is unresolved. She did laugh then, fully genuinely, the laugh that lived underneath the weight of what she was carrying and needed to come up for air. She was 27 years old. She had a tab on her sleeve and a confirmed operational record and a notebook full of corrections that had been, in the most literal sense, the architecture of everything she had become over the past 14 months. She was, in the ways that the word could hold its full meaning, a sniper, and she was still a signals analyst. The two things did not contradict each other. They were, she understood now, the same fundamental skill expressed in different registers, the ability to hold a problem clearly, without distortion, under pressure, and to act on it with precision at the moment the situation required action, and not a second before. She opened her notebook on the plane back to Fort Hood. She found the entry from week 3. The first time I was solving for the constraint. The second time I was solving for the target. Below it, she wrote the date. She wrote, graduated. First in class. The math led here. She closed the notebook. She looked out the window at the country below, which was large and green and completely indifferent to what had happened to her in the past year. And she thought about Flagstaff and the carnival booth and the 13-year-old girl who had told an incredulous teenager that she had done the math. She had been right then, she was right now. The math had always led here. She was ready.